Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'll be speaking with Allegra Love, a longtime New Mexico immigration and refugee advocate and attorney, and the founder and director of the Santa Fe Dreamers Project. She stepped down from that position just about a year ago, I think. And when I saw her newsletter and Facebook post last week, I featured it in the blog last week. I thought it would be a good time to catch up and find out what Allegra is doing now and what's going on at the border. I think we all assumed that things would get a lot better under President Biden. And while they have in many ways, in many areas, we'll hear from Allegra that the border isn't one of them. Last week, we had Mariel Manassi on the show. She's the lead attorney for New Energy Economy and their director. And the focus of the discussion was on one of the hottest topics circulating in New Mexico these days, and that's the proposed Avangrid-Iberdrola merger with PNM. It was a great interview, and I'd highly recommend you're catching it. If you're driving around today and don't catch all of today's show, you can watch today's show and all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, going over to the Actions and Events menu, and clicking on Retake Conversations. And before we get started with Allegra, as is our practice, I want to acknowledge that we're conducting this radio show on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for their custodial work with this land for centuries, generations and centuries. And we're going to definitely need to learn from them if we're going to be able to address the climate issues we're facing. So let's get started. Welcome, Allegra. It's been a long time since we've spoken, and so it's going to be good to catch up. Welcome aboard.
Thanks.
Okay, so I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you? How did you become an immigration attorney, wind up at SF Dreamers? And what are you doing now after a year after having left the Dreamers Project?
So I've told this story a lot, but the reason I got involved with immigrant rights was actually because I was a public school teacher here in Santa Fe Public Schools. In the early aughts, like during the Bush administration, right after 9/11. And I just was really disturbed to see like the effect that like interactions with ICE had on my students. I was working at a school that had mostly Mexican immigrant families. And ICE, the agency ICE, had just been created after 9/11, and the Department of Homeland Security had just been created. And I was just seeing like how much stress it caused my students when we had our first ICE raids in Santa Fe, and also like the stress of being undocumented and how it pushed otherwise fantastic families and families who should be thriving into the margins. And so I decided to go back to school to sort of learn about how to become the sharpest possible advocate for those families, and like understanding that this is a huge group of people in our community who I have deep love and respect for, who are like misunderstood and mistreated by our country. And anyway, went to UNM Law, came back, founded a nonprofit. So I don't like the idea of charging for services. So just like founded a nonprofit with community-based legal clinics to just be able to offer free services to those really deserving families who I was interacting with in the school system. And, you know, in 2014, when Obama like sort of revived the practice of family detention and built like a huge deportation mill for families in the desert of southern New Mexico, I really threw myself at that issue. I hadn't really been interested in border issues, really, or actually practicing like adversarial immigration court stuff. And that was kind of my like aha moment, was when Obama started detaining children, like hundreds and hundreds of people in the desert in Artesia. And that's sort of what introduced me and where I found my passion for what I do now, which is really working to fight the practice of detaining individuals at all, detaining immigrants. But really, like, where the people I work with are folks who are seeking asylum on the southern border. And so since I stopped being the ED of Santa Fe Dreamers, I've been working on a project I helped to found in El Paso called the El Paso Immigration Collaborative. And that is like, it's sort of like a national collaborative strategy to bring like aggressive legal services to bear on the 4 detention centers in ICE's El Paso ERO, which covers New Mexico and West Texas, and really trying to figure out how we get as many lawyers and advocates with eyes on the people detained in this detention region. And then where do we find pressure points? Where do we litigate? How do we get people out? How do we get every single person out? How do we create novel, innovative, powerful models of service and advocacy that actually do more than just like file a motion or represent someone, but like build power really against our government in the places where they're actively trying to hurt immigrant bodies, control immigrant bodies, and make money off of immigrant bodies.
Oh, is that located down in that's located down in El Paso?
I mean, sort of. We have an office there, but we have partners that work nationally. I mostly work from Santa Fe. Before the pandemic, I would go to El Paso like a couple weeks a month, but really, like it covers the El Paso ERO covers from basically the 4 corners all the way to some invisible point in West Texas, and you know, we have community-based partners in New Mexico, in West Texas. We have national organizations that we work with, pro bono law firms from big cities. So it really isn't based anywhere, but the power that we're trying to exert is like really kind of focused in El Paso. That's where I would say like 2 of the nastiest detention centers and 3 of the most nasty immigration courts are located.
So before I forget, can you tell people how they can find out about that project? I'm assuming you accept donations. I don't know whether you need volunteers, but tell us a little bit about that. I usually ask that at the end of the show, but we might run over the 30 minutes. And so I wanted to make sure that the radio folks got to hear this.
Yeah, I talk a lot. That project is called the El Paso Immigration Collaborative. I think if you just Google it, it'll come right up. I don't remember the website off the top of my head. I'm sure Paul can link it in the show notes or whatever. But we are trying to raise a little bit of money this summer to pay our legal assistants. So we always accept donations. We have 2 women UTEP graduates who are just holding it down and like basically quarterbacking a huge legal strategy. And this summer we're accepting donations to help pay for their salaries. It's a really worthy cause. So yeah, El Paso Immigration Collaborative. It's a very, very basic website. You'll see it. And it does a little more to explain what we're doing. And also, if you're interested in participating, we're always in need of remote volunteers. That's sort of one of the fun things that the pandemic created was we basically had to figure out how to do things remotely, and now we can just adopt those as best practices to try and like bring more people into the fight on the southern border.
Funny how that happened, huh? I mean, I think it happened for a lot of folks. Retake the same. We've suddenly got people from all over the state involved in what we do, whereas before it was largely a Santa Fe, maybe Albuquerque and Taos based. And so you learn to do Zoom. And now this radio show is on Zoom. So, you know, it's like much easier to pull off. So what are you doing? I mean, what is your role within that organization? Are you serving as executive director and are you working mostly with clients or mostly with attorneys and coordinating legal services?
So I try and do as little client work as possible. I've been doing direct services to immigrant families and detained immigrants for about a decade. And part of the reason I left my job was I just need a break from all that direct service. So what I am mostly trying to do is like kind of create a legal strategy. So the folks we work with have contact with individuals and interview them in detention. And then it comes to me and I get to be the one who decides what happens. What is the strategy to get this person out of detention? Which partner are we going to use nationwide to make sure this person gets out of detention? How do we use this information to make a lawsuit or put pressure on the field office director for ICE or contact the media? So I'm sort of running like a broad legal strategy to try and just like move people out of detention and, like I said, like create power against the government when it comes to detention in our state and in West Texas.
Okay, so I'm sure you, like most of us, were really kind of relieved when Biden won in November, and we're probably hoping that there was going to be at least some kind of shift in the policy at the border, and it doesn't appear to be the case. I know you were just down in El Paso. What did you find, and what do you think about Biden's transition from Trump in relation to border policy?
So I think it's worth just saying, because I think sometimes this has to be said. Personally, I was relieved that Joe Biden became the president. But then there's personal me and professional me. And professional me is who you're talking to right now. And I actually wasn't relieved. I mean, I guess I was relieved in the sense that it wasn't Donald Trump. But like, I had no expectation that a Biden-Harris administration was going to perform radically in the areas where I work. And I really want to resist this idea that Biden was the best we were going to do. And because of that, we have to sort of take whatever lack of policy failures they put up. And it's just because like this has been a really challenging time because people are saying like, don't complain, you get what you get. It's anything's better than Trump, but it's been almost 6 months since he was inaugurated.
Right.
And I'm really sick of hearing that. Like we need to move on from it.
Yeah,
and
the honeymoon's over.
Yeah. And so, I guess the important and interesting thing for me about President Biden being, I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn that off, the sound. But the important thing for me about President Biden being in office is that I hope that he can be moved through moral outrage in a way that the Trump administration like almost couldn't with a few exceptions.
Right.
And so this transition has been really weird because the Biden administration has said to us, like, we have human rights, a more humane approach to asylum, to the border, to detention. We have that in mind. Yet, functionally speaking, nothing has changed. The effect has been very little. And they keep telling us, like, be patient, give us 100 days, like lay off. We are going to fix these problems of the Trump administration, and we are going to like restore like a morality to our immigration policies, but it hasn't happened yet. This is probably like best exemplified by a policy called Title 42, which was a preemptive. Oh, I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. It was a pretextual closure of the US border to all people because of the coronavirus. And even at the time when it happened in March of 2020, the CDC was like, this isn't necessary. And it has been in place for, I guess, 15 months now. There has been a closure of the border. Like, you cannot seek asylum, which you just cannot. They'll bounce you right back into Mexico. And we had an expectation when the Biden administration took office and said, we're going to restore humanity, that they wouldn't leave this border closure in place, effectively forcing enormous volumes of migrants to stay in northern Mexico and wait. And they haven't lifted it yet. And they just keep telling us, like, we're not going to lift it even though Joe Biden yesterday got an email from the White House declaring that July 4th was the day the pandemic's going to be over, they're still restricting border crossing to asylum seekers and using the pandemic as an excuse. And Mayorkas is just saying, no, we're not going to do it. And all the advocates are like, we don't understand. You campaigned, you got our vote on the fact that you're going to bring humanity. And the easiest thing you could do, which is lift this border closure, you refuse to do. And I mean, and that's the best example I think I have right now of the disappointment and the failure of action that is really hurting human beings.
Okay, well, we're gonna have to take it sounds terrible. And that and his policies on gas and oil and the climate have been the two biggest disappointments since he's entered office. I mean, he is limited in some ways because he's got to work with Congress, but he doesn't on this. I mean, he could just lift that order tomorrow or today would be better. We're going to take a second here to remind our listeners that you're listening to KSFR 101.1 FM, and we're Northern New Mexico's media gem, I like to call it. It's offering tremendous interviews on culture, politics, the environment, and policy. And they also provide a wide array of music and entertainment. While there are no commercials on KSFR except for this one, they do have bills to pay. And so during Pledge Month, we were encouraging you to make donations to KSFR. And that Pledge Month just ended and they came up a bit short. So if you can go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button, I'd much appreciate it. And just view it as your ticket for admission to some great programming. I was going to ask you about other CBO efforts that are going on down by the border. Are there, I'm certain that there are church groups and other nonprofits that are offering other forms of support and services near the border. Are you aware of any of those? I mean, aside from legal services.
Yeah, like unfortunately, like a lot of the sort of support that's needed right now is in Mexico. And so there's like a lot of networks of like churches and faith-based organizations and community organizations in Juarez and Tijuana and Matamoros and some of those bigger border cities that are helping people who are stranded because of the border closures. Of course, you know, we have a ton of children who are also detained, but like that is not really an effort that can be supported by community groups. And they were releasing folks into communities because the borders never actually closed in the sense that they're always letting people in for one reason or another. And they were releasing people into communities, but I think that they've sort of changed that policy because detention centers are starting to fill up again as people are coming through the border. So I don't know that they're putting a lot of strain on the little towns that they were just like releasing migrants to anymore. But I would say like most of the humanitarian aid that I can see is needed in Mexico and not in the US.
Okay. But so I heard you just say that, you know, the border's closed, but that yet the border's closed, but some people are getting through. How does that work? I mean, who gets through, who doesn't, and how is that determined, or is it random, or is it?
You know, we don't like this is so complicated, and it's like it can be really unsatisfying as like a listener, especially because it's like unsatisfying for me as an attorney. Because I've been working in detention and for the last year, and theoretically, if no one was making it across the border, then there would be no one in detention, unless people were being arrested internally. But we were seeing tons and tons and tons of asylum seekers being admitted into these detention centers every day. And the question is why? Some people, it was because, you know, they experienced violence in Mexico. For example, like kidnapping or rape or some sort of physical assault that the government like sort of, I don't want to use the word compassion, but like sort of reasoned that it would be unsafe to send that particular person back into the streets of northern New Mexico because of violence that they experienced, which is a pretty shocking condemnation of the policy that say a woman would need to be raped to be able to make it safely across the border. And like a border that is supposed to be completely porous to asylum seekers at any given time based on our agreements and the conventions we've signed on to in international law. So they also sometimes let like certain like ethnic groups just are getting across the border. Like a lot of Cubans this year successfully navigated their way across the border. I'm dealing with an extraordinary volume of Haitian individuals right now detained in our area. So it just sort of depends, because remember, like for this system to function and control bodies, we need to have a crisis at any given time. And for the system to profit off of these bodies, people need to be in detention centers. And so even though we have the mechanisms to actually shut down the border, we have immigration courts, we have an enforcement system, and most importantly, we have corporations that thrive on immigration enforcement that has to be fed. And so the alternatives that exist to detention and detaining individuals are very clear, but we are dependent on this structure of law enforcement, and especially like these very, very powerful corporations need to keep making money. And so they have to keep putting people in the beds so that we don't breach these corporate contracts that we have to make sure there's X number of beds on any given night of immigrants for people to profit off of.
So we're going to shift just a little bit here. You may have known that 3 years ago, Roxanne and I went on a three-month, 10,000-mile car trip across the United States. And we visited progressive communities, whether they were doing, sometimes it was an organization that was doing great work, like in Push Buffalo. Sometimes it was a city like Rochester, New York, that was had formed partnerships with community workers and formed worker-owned cooperatives. But regardless of what we had gone to those communities for, in almost every one of them, there was a vibrant refugee or immigrant community that was making a huge contribution to that community. I mean, the people in those communities and the government in those communities welcomed people from other countries and wanted more of them, basically. And it was remarkable from an economic and a cultural perspective. They were really important contributors to the local economy and the local community. Given that, are you aware of programs that allow cities to, get a block grant or something like that so that they can transition families, refugees into their, like, basically sponsorship programs where people could sponsor, and if not, I would think that there are cities that would like to do that. And that could be a way of relieving the pressure at the border. There's something, but that certainly wouldn't feed the beast, the need to have people in beds.
Of course, these programs don't exist. And like, of course, that's a better idea than a shameful detention strategy. But the problem is, Paul, is that like our country is really, really sure about this premise that unless we hurt people and unless we punish them, we are going to have an out of control refugee crisis on our border. Well, here's the thing, we already do. Like, at least that's the narrative they're selling anyway, right? Like, whether it's the Democrats saying, don't yell at us that we're detaining kids because it's an out of control crisis, or the Republicans saying open borders are calling an out of control crisis. Politically speaking, everyone agrees we're in a crisis because the crisis narrative is what allows them to hurt people in the way that they want to. So they're saying, like, we're gonna have a crisis unless we hurt people, but they're hurting people now and it's not solving the crisis. But we're so addicted to this idea that migration and movement is so inherently immoral that unless we inflict pain and suffering on the people who choose to do it, we will be overrun by their immorality. And unfortunately, that is so linked to Black and brown bodies and this racism. Like, we can't have hordes of brown people coming up from the South with their badness. And like, I think like Trump nakedly said it when he said like these countries are sending their worst people, they're shithole countries. But like the Democratic Party's position where they're detaining children, where they're keeping the border closed, where Kamala Harris comes down and threatens the entire world of nations and says, don't try to come to our border, we're going to hurt you if you do. Like, that is continuing the project of saying pain and suffering is necessary to exert control over these bodies. And so we have to give up on that idea that we need to inflict pain before we can even sit around the table and say, how can we invite and offer benefits with which to maximize the economic and the cultural and the creative benefits that immigrants bring into our, sort of flailing society.
Mhm.
But the other one, this really makes my head start to spin, and I know your listeners are really going to appreciate this, is when you also think about what climate change is going to do to global migration over the next century. And this insistence that we have that we can hurt people who need to move is going to look really bad when huge populations of people are moving simply because they can't get a clean glass of water or grow food to eat.
Yep. Yep. No, I mean, I that was going to be my next question, actually, was if we think this is a crisis and this is how we deal with those crises, we'll have, I mean, I think that that's something that all of the countries of the global north, it's almost like we owe the reparations to the global south. We've caused most of the climate conditions in those communities with our extractive industries. We've created most of the dictatorships. We've created most of the lack of the gang stuff that goes on in Guatemala and so forth. And then we just turn our back to the people when they start coming here saying, you can't come here. I don't know that I'm glad I'm 70. I don't want to be here in 30 years when those kinds of manifestations of American hubris become apparent, unless we can figure something out. So that's a segue into the next question, and that is, and we'll probably break in the middle of this question, and then do the close to the radio show, and then just continue the conversation for a few more minutes. But you're in charge, Allegra. Somehow not Deb Haaland, and in fact, Deb Haaland, I mean, you're in charge of the immigration situation, and you don't even have to go to Biden and get his okay. You can just start recreating an immigration system that Allegra Love decides is a good one. What do you do?
So this is maybe like the number one question that I get from people, and I feel like it's a really unfair question, because why on earth would it be on me? Why wouldn't I also have like smart policymakers, smart people from the affected communities? Like, I've never had the opportunity, like we've been so limited and so constricted that I've never had the opportunity to just like sit around and workshop that. People are always like, what would you do? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, we've been fighting for so long. I need a year of sitting around with really smart people to figure out those alternative solutions. And I always get this like pushback, like, well, if I don't have my idealist utopian solution readily available, then I had better shut the hell up. But now that you're asking, so I'm going to say like, that's an unfair question, and I don't really know, and I need a lot of help from a lot of people if I was going to be the czar of immigration.
Okay,
but,
wait. I have to tell you not to shut up, but to politely, we have to close the show.
Oh, okay.
And so listeners, if you get home and you go, whoa, what happened? She didn't tell us what she'd do as Czarina. We're going to talk about that on the Zoom, continue that conversation, and I'll be back next week with a guest not sure who. Allegra Love is our guest today, and she's leading an organization, El Paso Immigration Collective. You can get information about that on the website, and I'd encourage you to make a donation. I'm quite sure, knowing Allegra as I do, that those dollars will be used very wisely. So thank you for being with the show, Allegra, and if you'll just hold with us for a second, we got to do a little 10 seconds of silence so the engineer can figure out when to clip the show. Thank you very much, Allegra. That was a mistake. Recording stopped. So we're going again. All right. You're the czar. Now, you said you're going to convene a bunch of really smart people. And do you have any sense of what it wouldn't look like? And I mean, it certainly wouldn't look like what it is now. But I mean, you know, Kamala Harris, who I actually worked with in San Francisco when she was the assistant district attorney on drug court, forming a drug court there. And she was an impediment. And so it doesn't surprise me that she would be taking the position of, you know, that don't come. But what are your thoughts about the hubris of her thinking that by us putting together $1 billion and sending it to Guatemala, that would fix the problem? Like Americans always think they can fix things.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I do want to go back to your question about like what I would do.
Okay.
And I do want to frame it with what you're saying is we have a very limiting administration right now when it comes to immigration. We have Biden and Harris, and neither of whom I'm expecting to be great radical and progressive thinkers on this cause. So with the question of if I was working under them and didn't need their permission,
or any cause.
What?
I said, or any cause.
Okay. But what I do, I think there's a lot of really, really good solutions that they could implement right now. One is we don't need to have detention centers for immigrants in the United States. Detention centers are there to ensure that people show up for immigration hearings. That's what they're there for. No one's being charged with a crime. We don't need to have them. If you need someone to show up at a hearing to be removed from the United States, there's so much technology, GPS technology, ankle monitor technology, which I don't love, but at least the person's not in a prison. Right. We don't need to have detention centers, and we don't need corporations making money off it. So the first thing is just like decarcerate the entire immigration system. They're unnecessary. It's bad policy, unless you're trying to inflict pain, right? If you're making someone suffer, if you're making someone feel pain, that's what the policy is. It has nothing to do with people efficiently showing up at immigration court. We can do that without torturing people.
Well, isn't the show up rate astronomical?
Oh yeah, and it's super high. And you know what, it's even higher? When they have lawyers. So a second thing, fund a universal representation program for people who are facing removal in immigration court. Most people don't understand that you are not being accused of a crime when you are being removed from the United States. So you don't get a constitutionally appointed lawyer like you would if you were being accused of like a DUI. You don't get a public defender, which is why the vast majority of immigrants, including children who are alone, go to immigration court without a lawyer. One way that you can ensure that justice happens, that people show up, that these cases are adjudicated according to the law, is give them a representative. You could take the money that you save from not having 250 detention centers around the country and paying those contracts and train advocates to be lawyers in the immigration courts. The immigration courts are a mess. There's 1.3 million backlog cases in the immigration courts right now. You know what they should do? Just wipe all those cases off the docket. Most Americans have no idea that that backlog exists. All the people who are in this backlog are currently living in the United States under the letter of law, because when you have a case pending in immigration court, the government knows you're here waiting for your immigration court hearing. Just end the backlog, and reshape the immigration courts. The immigration courts are under the Department of Justice. They're not an independent judiciary. They are being controlled by the same person who controls the Department of Homeland Security. When I'm in court, the judge's boss is sitting in the White House, and the opposing counsel's boss is sitting in the White House. They are enacting the same domestic policy on my clients that I'm trying to defend. Push that out of there. Get the immigration courts independent under Congress or the judicial branch. So these are solutions that the Biden and Harris administration can do today. They know this. They've been advised all of this by all the wonderful people I work with who were invited to seat at the table now and during the transition. But it doesn't win them any points with centrist and Republican voters. I heard this thing about how like abolish ICE isn't popular. It's actually not, like, it's a thing that I talk about a lot, but most Americans don't. It's too scary. I mean, just do it. I think that like most Americans will realize if we abolish ICE that your life isn't going to change radically. Crime isn't going to go up. But it takes someone demonstrating that to help Americans make that change. Like, it's important that yesterday was the 9-year anniversary of Dreamers Deferred Action, the policy that Obama created that let Dreamers stay in the country. And it was radical at the time. They were like, we're not going to deport these people? Well, no. And maybe there was some shock around that for like a month or two. And then they just started registering for the program and getting social security numbers and assimilating even more into US society. And now there's enormous popular approval of Dreamers. We have more Dreamers in this community who are basically invisible as an immigrant and are instead, their identity is teacher, nurse, doctor, lawyer, neighbor, mother, father, homeowner. And like, we just got used to it when Obama and the organizers who pushed him to it made that bold move and just changed policies. Our country adapted. And that's what I think I see lacking in this government is the courage to say, like, we were elected on these convictions and we're just going to do it. And everyone needs to come along because it's obviously the right thing to not torture people on the southern border. And we can find a different solution, but we have to take a step. And they're not taking those steps.
No, they're not. And, I really appreciate your being with us today, Allegra. Did you have any more thoughts on, what you would do in relation to trying to address some of the issues that get people to, one of the things I wrote about when I published your Facebook post, I prefaced it by saying, people don't just decide, let's go for a 1,400-mile walk through Mexico on the hope that we can get into the United States. The conditions in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras are deplorable. And going back to when I was 19, my first introduction to kind of international politics and American imperialism was in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Chile. And, it's our I can never say that word, hegemony, hegemony. No,
Hegemony.
Huh?
Hegemony.
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 Hegemony. Yeah. Hegemony. That has created these conditions. It seems kind of naive to think that the people who have come up with those policies will come up with solutions. But what could the United States do that would minimize the conditions or address the conditions, not minimize, eliminate the conditions that drive people to leave their country?
Unfortunately, this is not my area of expertise. I don't work in international aid, so I could speculate, but it's not something I feel comfortable really like speaking about as like an expert. I think that you're right. I think that this is like a dual project. I don't think that sending, like there was like Kamala Harris is going down to Central America to work on the root causes. Obviously, I think migrants would agree. People don't want to leave their homes. People don't
Right.
want to migrate to the United States. I think that's like a confusion that a lot of Americans have, that hubris of being like, they just want to come here. Who wants to abandon their country and their families and their home and the holidays they spend with their family and the smells that make home feel good and the house they were raised in? Like, nobody wants to abandon that. And so I think like everyone can agree that working on the project of making these countries a safer place to be is better, and would really take care of one of the factors of migration, which is the push, right? The push from other countries because there's violence or it's just like hideously impoverished. But I think that like what Americans need to come to terms with, I mean, and this goes for like almost everything we're sad about right now, is we're gonna have to let go of this like extractive, capitalist, militarized frame of mind that we have if we're going to help create places where people can live happily. And like we're just not there. Like this like our like globalization, just like constantly making money off of trade and people's labor and extracting as much as we can out of countries and funding regimes that help us extract more and make more money from countries is always going to be causing this push. And it's, you know, it's, I think like a lot, like one of the most important things to understand when you think about this is this modern phenomena of migration that started in the 90s, all the things that have led to these policies that we are at the I guess if you want to call it a crisis, like the crisis point we're at, it started when NAFTA got signed,
Right.
right? And we destroyed small farmers' abilities to do their thing and locally, and we undercut enormous markets in Mexico. People started to have to come move north. And then they moved north, and we were so alarmed by the wave that we closed the border and criminalized the border and cut off any ability for them to come back. So this border restriction actually makes like the volume of people living and residing and spending their lives in the United States more powerful, because when we decided to shut down the border because the waves of migration, the NAFTA calls, we cut off the return trip and we made people who had been for generations moving freely through the borderlands have to choose which country they wanted to live in, and not to be able to say, I'm going to give my labor in this market and come home to here and raise my family and do that. They had to decide to stay in the North because that's where the money was. And I think that's one of the things that like a lot of Americans don't understand about the phenomena of illegal migration from Mexico.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, they also have the inaccurate perception that those folks are taking their jobs when, you know, and I guess it's one of the frustrations that Roxanne and we talk about this all the time, is like, we've read so much in the last 5 or 6 years on, and it's like, there's so many things that are so patently false in our collective understanding of the way things work that you don't even know where to begin trying the education process. And people have shut out the alternative information and live in these information silos right now. And so people go around thinking that, you know, the brown people coming up from the border are gonna, you know, rape their daughter, steal their car, take their job, not pay taxes, blah, 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 when all the research and data in the world show that the reverse is true, that they're less likely to do any of those things than your next door neighbor, you know? And it's like, but how do you make that change in people's perceptions?
Well, I think that the suggestion I always have is for people who are like, this seems overwhelming, is to start by like literally just like meditating on the fact that there's nothing criminal about migration and no one needs to be punished, and illegal should not be a word that comes in. And people get uncomfortable because they're like, but we have to have that. You're like, well, actually, it's a pretty modern concept. And let's just take, like any meditation activity, take 10 minutes out of your day and think about a world where we didn't have to have that. Let yourself just occupy that and start to see and start to imagine what the world might be like. I think we are just trapped in this issue and in so many other issues in our country in this paradigm that's completely constructed. And like the way we're going to get out of it is by saying like finding a way to invite migrants in and maximize their creative energy, their cultural energy, their business stuff, the workforce is probably the most rational idea we can have in this country right now, and not a radical one. But we have to get away from this idea that loving people and inviting them and creating situations for them to thrive is a radical act. It's the rational act. What should be seen as radical is putting someone in handcuffs in a jumpsuit in a maximum security prison who comes to try and better themselves and better our country. Like it's, I just think like think about if you had to flee, let's say north, because of something terrible that was going on in your community. I think after this year, we can all feel a little closer to what that might feel like. And imagine you got to the border and the first thing they did was take you individually, all your family members away from you, put you in handcuffs and a jumpsuit and put you in a maximum security prison without legal counsel and any understanding of why you're there or what you can do to get out. Imagine if that happened to you. We accept that as the only rational response when it is actually a violently radical response to migration. And we have to just we have to shift that premise and then start to build in the ways you were saying, like, how do we build cities around this idea that we're always going to have immigrants who have a lot to offer?
Wow. I actually think I'm going to write a little bit about what you just said, because I think those imagination, put yourself in their shoes, Santa Fe, horrendous fire, destroys the town. You've got nothing. You've got to go to Cleveland, or you've got to go to wherever where you've got family or friends, and they set up things and arrest you.
And take your children from you.
And yeah.
Which they're still doing.
I'd be going to stay with my children.
Right.
But no, I mean, I think when people start to actually, I think that's where empathy lives, is when you can start to imagine that happening to you. How would it feel? And then it also, that can lead you to, that's no more crazy what we just described, Santa Fe burns to the ground and we have to flee, than what they're facing. Their towns, their countries are burning, and they flee to something where they can be safe. And what do they wind up happening? Get arrested.
And I think I see this thing, I do this myself, and I see great people I know do this too, is you do this sort of mental gymnastics when you think about this, where you're like, maybe they're stronger than me. Like, maybe they don't love their children in the same way I love. Maybe they wouldn't grieve leaving their country in the same way I would grieve walking away from a home I built, or like a community that I had grown up in. So we do this stuff like, because it's so painful to imagine what is happening to these folks, we tend to other them in this way where we're like, maybe they're stronger, maybe they're braver, maybe they're more callous. And refugees are just regular ass people. They are not braver than you. They don't love their children in different ways. They don't care less about where they're from and their roots and their culture. They just are doing it because they have to. And like, people are always like, would you have the strength to do that? And I'm like, yes, I would. Refugees are not superhuman people. They're people who are doing things they have to do and putting one foot in front of the other. And we would all do it. So I don't have children of my own. I have nephews, and I'm like very closely helping to raise some of them. And I think about how if I came to a border with them, the US border, they would be taken from me because I'm not their biological mother. And I think how I would lay down and want to die. Like, I start crying. Like, I would want to lay down and die if that happened to me. 6 years old and 8 years old, these boys. And the fact that these people can, like, do not lay down and die and cannot be deterred in their movement, even though that's a possibility if that's what could happen, has to be a testament of the powerful forces that are causing migration. And this like hubristic idea that Kamala Harris can go down to the border and wave her finger and say, don't come, because all they needed to hear was a stern warning of a vice president of the United States, is just so incredibly demented when it comes to understanding why people migrate. Like the love, the necessity, the bravery, the lack of options. It doesn't need someone just saying, don't come, don't do it. They know not to come. They don't want to come. Sorry, I get really worked up, as you can tell.
Well, and it's one of the reasons I've always liked you, Allegra. You know, it's some people can be policy wonks and advocates on principle, but they don't necessarily feel it in their gut, and you know, are not offended by the things they're working against. But my favorite people are the ones who, you know, and I'll start to cry now, who feel it in their gut and are offended by the morals and the ethics involved. And so I really want to thank you for being with me. And I know you probably got other things to do, but I appreciate it very much. We'll get this thing posted on the website, and let's stay in touch. And I'll also hunt down that website, put it in the blog for your organization, and encourage people to make donations and explore ways they can work from home to support what you're doing.
Yeah, and I also I think I sent you, Paul, the link to sign up for my newsletter, which is a lot more focused than these like rants you've been listening to for an hour. But every couple weeks I send out like a sort of like a explainy policy, what's going on the southern border, what's going on in immigration newsletter. And I work really hard on them. I've gotten some good feedback, and I think it's a really good way to stay in touch with what's happening.
Okay.
That's a little from a different focus of like the media.
Okay. And I'll put the link to signing up for the newsletter in there as well. And I'll sign up for the newsletter as well. And all right, thanks, Allegra. Keep up the work. I hope you can find some time to chill once in a while, because you know, the work you do there's a reason why you were burnt out after 10 years of doing it, you know?
Yeah, but I'm also like a professional chiller because I have to be. So like last weekend, I was just tubing down the Rio Grande, first in Pilar, then over here in Buckman. Like I am so pro at chilling so that I can keep doing this work. So I got you.
Take care. Chill on. Bye-bye.